Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, the first of a double bill today, both of which are earlier than our normal time because of reasons. Anyway, August 1944 was the beginning of Patton's ascendancy once again. His time around D-Day on Ike's naughty step was now firmly at an end. So Kevin, regular guest, is back to explain Patton's vision for the France campaign, his feelings about Brittany, his feelings about breakthrough, etc., etc. He's the author of a trilogy of books, two of which are out, and the story we're talking today covers both books, so you'll have to go and get both of them. Patton's War, Volume 1, Volume 2, there we all are. The links to them in the description below. But I'll bring him in now. We last met at We Have Ways in July. Good afternoon, or morning where you are. How are you today, Kevin?
Morning, Paul. I had to wear my Villanova cap, give some love to my grad school there to get us started. And how are we doing this morning? You can take your hat off too if you want. I don't care.
Then all the light reflects on my head, and then people get disturbed and freaked out by it. It's just my thing now. So this, I think, will be our last show about Brittany in this series of shows. Well, I'm sure we'll revisit it later on. And Patton has kind of featured in all of them because of the varying opinions and options available to the Americans, and particularly when you get to this time 80 years ago, the American Third Army are as far west as Brest in Brittany and as far east as Metz, nearly into Germany. It's extraordinary distance that army is covering. So I'm assuming because of so much happening in August, that was kind of a fun period to write about, in that Patton's kind of really starting to coming into his own again.
Yes, very much so. So we're looking at August 1st, 1944, when Third Army becomes active on the continent. Patton had arrived about a month earlier and was kind of getting himself warmed up, waiting for enough tanks and infantrymen and tankers and everything to get ashore so that they could bring, Third Army onto the line. And I guess a big myth about a lot of this is that, Patton launches Operation Cobra. That he had very little to do with it. That was an Omar Bradley operation, cracking the line at Saint-Malo and racing tanks and infantry south. And also the credit goes to Troy Middleton, because he makes the decision to put two armored divisions in the front, whereas he had previously had infantry. And a lot of people credit Patton with that, but I've checked the timeline. Middleton did that early in the morning of, I think it was July 26th. And Patton goes and visits his headquarters that night. So he had already made that decision. That's Troy Middleton right there, pinning a second star on General Stroh, who commands a 79th Infantry Division, which is going to be one of the early infantry divisions into the continent. Can we go back to that map real quick? Yeah, so we're looking at the real sort of breakout or breakthrough, and Patton's real mission is to go west, to get those ports open at Brest, Lorient, and Vannes. The idea of him heading east is not very strong at this point. You can notice this map goes all the way up to the 9th, but around August 3rd, 4th, Omar Bradley finally makes a decision to allow him to use one of his other corps under Hayslip to head sort of south and east. Before that, Bradley really wanted to use that corps as a shield. So you've got the sword going west with the shield in the east. And of course, they're draining everything through the area of Avranches. That's a that Patton has to squeeze division after division through. Now, obviously, the first two divisions through are going to be the 4th Armored and the 6th Armored. 6 under Gros. We can move forward, but you can see the distances and how important Brest is at that point. So Middleton's the corps commander. Stroh's going to be one of the division commanders. And let's kind of set the scene. Next slide. We've got them all in alphabetical order. Yeah. So Omar Bradley, I mentioned, commanded 1st Army. He lands the 1st Army in Normandy, clears out the Cherbourg Peninsula. It's Omar Bradley in the middle there, and then presses south to Saint-Malo. On August 1st, his command of 1st Army is going to transfer to Courtney Hodges there on the left. And Patton's going to get 3rd Army. He's obviously on the right. And Omar Bradley's going to be promoted now to Army Group Commander. So the dynamic has really changed here. Whereas Patton was the top dog in North Africa and Sicily, and Omar Bradley served underneath him, it's now Omar Bradley in command of an army group, 2 entire armies, Hodges and Patton. And surprisingly, the situation works out rather well. Eisenhower is very uncertain about the idea of Bradley commanding Patton. Would Patton, go by this? And Patton gives him total assurances. He doesn't want to make any waves. He just wants to fight the enemy. And so that is the new group dynamic that we're dealing with. Next slide.
But the thing is, before we get into this, is that
yeah,
once we get to Operation Cobra, and we've talked about it before, and Patton's involvement was key to the latter stage. But as I say, it was all, as you said, it was Middleton, it was Bradley there. But it's not going to take long for Patton, once things go well and things start kind of falling into place for him to start gaining that confidence he'd had a year earlier. He's served his time, as I said in the introduction there. He's just waiting now to kind of be George S. Patton again, isn't he? So it's not going to take long.
No, he is our most experienced army commander at this point. Like I had mentioned, North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Sicily. He's made his mistakes. He's learned what the enemy's strengths and weaknesses are. He's learned what the American Army's strengths and weaknesses are. And he's ready to apply all that he's learned and all that he's experienced, both the good and the bad. And that's what he brings to the battlefront. And it's going to make a difference right off the bat. One of those huge differences we're looking at right here, one of the big problems in North Africa and Sicily was if you were on the ground and the Germans attacked and you called for air support, it took between 60 and 80 minutes for an aircraft to get overhead. Okay. Opie Weiland, his 9th Tactical Air Corps commander, he's going to give him the job of protecting his flanks. Never been done in the history of warfare. He said, you are protecting the flanks of my drives. And his commander, Caseta, had experimented with putting Air Force or Army Air Force's radios in tanks and taking pilots, putting them in those tanks. So there's better communication between the ground and the air, because pilots speak a same language that men on the ground just can't even fathom to the pilots flying above them. And so now, instead of calling in for a plane and waiting 60 minutes to 80 minutes, they're circling above the American forces at all times, basically. Mort Shefflow, one of the veterans I interviewed, he talked about that there were always American planes flying above them in packs of 4. And what these aircraft are going to do is they're just going to, every time the radio call comes in, tanks, when they come across a defensive position, are just going to pull up to the side of the road, call in for an airstrike. Plane's going to come down, bash the roadblock. They'll do back and forth strafing. And once it's destroyed, they will fly over the armored columns doing, barrel rolls while the guys are standing on the tanks cheering them. A real different atmosphere than the hedgerow grudging fighting that's been going on for the last 2 months. And so with this weapon, Patton's going to be able to achieve great things and drive quickly, which is exactly what he wants to do. He wants to prevent the Germans from defending and blowing up the ports at Brest and Driant, or Lorient. So next slide. Paul, your comments?
My comments are going to be about what we're going to talk about next, which is Ultra, because one of the recurring themes in this discussion about Brittany is now they're starting to get a conflict between the information on the ground coming back from recon units, aircraft flying over, and Ultra, which now is starting to become a real part of everything the Allies are planning. It's proved its worth for the build up to Overlord. It's starting to really reap dividends. The suspicion about it of 2 years earlier has gone, but it can sometimes play a different picture of what's going on, because there can be that difference in the situation reports between on the ground and at a higher level. Does this feature into the decisions of Bradley and Patton, all these people this time, this conflict between real intel you can see and what's coming in from Ultra?
Yes, very much. In fact, in this photograph, long referred to as Patton talking with Hugh Gaffey, now it's been revealed that officer standing there, his name is Melvin Heffers, and he is one of the Ultra officers who brings this top secret information to Patton, which he's going to use almost like a Bible. In fact, he tells heifers to make little maps for him with the information. He goes, "Sir, you can't take this information out of here." And he goes, "No, no, no, it's on me." And so he would go to his corps commanders and tell them how to position things. And this is where you get that myth of Patton's sixth sense. Like, oh my God, he could read a battlefield better than anyone because he's relying on that information. Now, you were talking about the conflict. The information is not always perfect. When Middleton starts to head into the Brittany Peninsula, he says to Patton, "How many forces am I facing?" He goes, "About 1,000 troops." He was off by about 9,000. There were 10,000 troops in the Brittany Peninsula, including the 266th German Infantry Division under Karl Spang. And that's going to cause some headaches for the drive to Brest. And we'll get into that as we go further. So, yeah, there is that conflict that the information they're getting is going to kind of lead Patton astray. In fact, he tells Middleton to bypass Saint-Malo because there's not really any enemy there. It's okay. But then, as Middleton follows those orders, the troops are getting fired on and everything, and he has no choice but to turn to Saint-Malo and try to knock them out. And Paul, am I pronouncing Saint-Malo correctly?
Saint-Malo, yeah. Saint-Malo, yeah.
Saint-Malo. Okay, I always say Malo. Okay, Malo.
Malo makes try to sound like something else, but Malo, yeah. But okay. Mag will correct me later on. But yeah.
Okay, next slide.
Just a quick question about Patton. When did Patton get brought into the ultra circle? Because that's one of the things, as the war goes on, more and more commanders are being brought in. Was it in North Africa, Tunisia, or was it in 44?
Yeah, it certainly was. The very first book on what did you ask? I thought you added a question.
I asked about sorry.
So yeah, it's really when he takes over in Tunisia that he's given this information. I think the first book out on Ultra was called The Ultra Secret by, I think it was like Wigginbottom. And he talks about going to Patton and telling him about this tool of war. And at first Patton kind of downplays it, doesn't care about it. A British officer, but then learns to embrace it and really use it. He doesn't really talk about it in North Africa and Sicily. In fact, his intelligence chief, Koch, comes to him, and when they're in France, and Patton's like, "Wait a second, where's all this information coming from?" And he goes, "Well, we've told you, we've got this system that you didn't really want to use as much in North Africa and Sicily." And Patton goes, "Okay, forget what I said. From now on, every morning after the morning brief, we're having an ultra brief." So he did have access to this information early on, but he really embraces it here in France.
And my next question is going to be, because it came in from a viewer, about Cherbourg, because all this push to Brittany because of the use of the ports, Joe Balkowski talked about that, had been written into the Overlord plan right early on. But Cherbourg had been, several divisions pushing up there. They'd got there, they'd lost lots of carriages, and then the harbor ended up not being usable to the extent they want. So was there maybe a situation where they should have paid more attention to what happened in Cherbourg and revised the Brittany plan, or was the push for those ports going to happen regardless?
I think it was going to happen regardless. It was always in the plan. Also, if you look at the North Africa campaign, Operation Torch, everything is centered around ports. Yep. We're going to take the beaches, but we got to take a port. And that's why they picked, Oran and Algiers and Rabat, because, yes, they had beaches that you could easily land troops on, but you needed the ports for a modern military. A modern army is going to have tanks and artillery and all this heavy equipment that you really could. The best way to go is a port. That's basically what all of Normandy is about. The ability to hoodwink Hitler to thinking it's going to be at Pas-de-Calais because of the port. And so, to make this rapid change and say, well, I don't think this is going to work anymore, it's kind of denying years and years of combat experience. And yeah, by the way, that's very hard to follow up after Joe Balkowski. He gave an excellent presentation on your show. And I didn't even realize Brest had never been taken during the war, because I actually went back and read it in my own book. But Patton ignores it at the end of August, that it gets transferred over to Simpson's Fifth Army. But that's going to be a headache for the Allies. Now, Patton did have a conversation with Bradley as he's sweeping, close to the German border. Bradley takes fighter aircraft away from him because he says we needed to crack these harbors, these ports in France, because we can't let the Germans have the propaganda to say they defeated us. And Patton agrees with that. Yeah, we don't want to have any losses. So if we're going for these ports, we got to keep fighting for them, even if the end result is, this thing has been totally demolished and it's unusable for 6 months. We need the psychological victory of saying, no, we've captured these things.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the 2 armored commanders that are basically tasked with, flying on the ground to these ports way out west. First is Richard Grow. Grow's going to command the 6th Armored Division. He is one of the brain trusts of armor between World War I and World War II. He goes to a camp called Knox with a bunch of other officers who are in the cavalry because they want to get away from the cavalry school at Fort Riley, because the commander of cavalry says there's no use of tanks in the future. So they steal away to this old Civil War camp, which is obviously now Fort Knox, and they start working on theory and maneuver and practicing. So he really deserves a lot more credit than he gets, but he just had some bad run-ins with Patton during the Louisiana maneuvers. He sat down, was having this big shrimp lunch, and Patton comes across him and kind of looks angrily at him for kind of relaxing while his men are in the field. He, again, right before August 1st, Patton's going to come across him near the river south of, it's north of Avranches.
Yep, I know the one you mean. Can't think what it's called. Yeah,
Couton. And he's like, "What are you doing right now?" And he goes, "Nothing." Thinking explodes. What do you mean you're doing nothing? We got a river here. You got to cross it. And Patton walks across the river, and it's a very small river, that one just south of Couton. But Grow knew that the tide was going to be coming in soon, and it was going to flood the river. But Patton orders him, to go across immediately, which he does. And because of that little incident, Grow was supposed to take Avranches. Patton gives that job to John Wood in the 4th Armored. So, a little bit of bad blood there. Grow does a magnificent job, I think, throughout the entire war. But the 4th Armored is really going to be Patton's baby. Let me go to the next slide, because that's now going to be Tiger Jack Wood, commander of the 4th Armored Division. His nickname is P for professor because he tutored so many of his fellow students at West Point. And he's actually going to come from the artillery branch. So where so many tankers come from cavalry, speed, he's thinking power, and coordinating fires and stuff. When he gets to Couton first, basically walks through a minefield and sends a note back to send, hey guys, come through this way, captures a German, he sees a German anti-tank gun in an alley firing on tanks and orders a tank destroyer to fly in there real fast before they can coordinate and knock it out. And they do. Very beloved by his troops, but very temperamental, which eventually will cost him his job. And he's about to do a maneuver that's going to infuriate Patton. So what do we got for the next slide? Okay, so August 1st, the day Patton's army becomes active and they start pushing west, one of the first places they take is Mont Saint-Michel, which you and I have talked about on the show before. And it's taken by a single soldier, Freeman Brower, who basically rolls in on a Jeep with 2 reporters, and the Germans immediately surrender, and the people living there are holding up babies for him to kiss, and he signs the ledger there that he's entered the town, first American in. And it just becomes a big story because it's such a iconic piece of France. It's one of the man-made wonders of the world. And so that's when, and Patton even honeymooned there in 1905, I believe it was. So it's something close to Patton's heart. And every soldier who goes into the Brittany Peninsula will talk about in their memoirs somewhere seeing this on the horizon. Because and I, Paul, that, you could be 8 miles away from this thing and still see it. The ground is so flat and it's so prominent on the horizon.
And it reminds me, Kevin, of the discussion we had with Mark Calhoun at the beginning of this Brittany series, is that as we get into August and September, it's the balancing between what are the Allies trying to achieve? Are they trying to defeat and destroy the German army? Are they trying to liberate places of maybe sort of propaganda and historical purpose? Are they trying to gain ground? Because those three things don't necessarily, complement each other. That's as you said earlier about those ports, that had been such a big part of German propaganda, the U-boat pens, all that, sending out those patrols into the North Atlantic. And if you don't go for them, the Germans are keeping that essence of their propaganda machine in their hands. So I can really see the general dilemma that everyone is facing that summer is what is our primary purpose right now? And the point is they're all important. It's a question of which one is the most important, and it's a constantly changing situation.
Right. And in Eisenhower's view, if I want to, and Eisenhower's mission is to go into the heart of Germany and destroy it. Yeah. But if he wants to do that, he's going to need his supply lines. And so it's like, before we start talking about all these great maneuvers, we need those supply lines. Now, they actually do the entire Fillet Pocket. They basically encircle a German army, with the supply lines they have through Normandy. It's after that, after August or mid-August, that they're going to start stretching beyond their means as they start heading east. And that's where they create things like the Red Ball Express. The Red Ball Express was not immediate. It was not needed for the Fillet Pocket campaign. It's after that. Before that, they're all relying on the fuel and everything coming up from Normandy. So yeah, it's you've got to, do one before the other, but then the results on the field change all these well-known plans, these maxims that you have to have a port, you have to do these things, because like Joe said, they don't get any of these ports out west. They're never used. Cherbourg gets used. Saint-Malo doesn't really get used. They eventually do capture it by the end of the month, but it's a hard nut to crack. And I think when we're all younger, it's like, it's the Americans and the British. You just circle the Germans and take care of them. We don't think about those logistics and where's everything coming from. And all of the Allies' math said you can't do this over the beaches, yet they really do, Yeah. So next slide. So here we are breaking out of the hedgerow country and entering the Brittany atmosphere. Now, yes, the terrain does change greatly from the terrain that they had been going through north of Saint-Malo. In fact, I almost think the idea of the hedgerow cutters they put on the tanks is almost too little too late, because once they start gearing it up, within days, they're out of hedgerow country. Now, I talked about Gros and Wood. And so Gros is going to go, racing. He's got the farther distance to go, over 100 miles to Brest. And on August 4th, Patton's going to go visit him, and his division is stopped. And Patton's furious. Why did you stop? And Gros like kind of bumbling his answer, but one of his staffers stepped up and shows Patton a message from Troy Middleton, his corps commander, saying, "Stop. We need to kind of reorganize and everything." And Patton sees the note and just shakes his head. He goes, "God." And he was such a good soldier in World War I because Middleton had fought and had earned medals and stuff like that. Patton's idea is just speed, almost to a fault. Along with the 6th Armored and the 4th Armored, he's going to create a little force out of the 15th Cavalry to kind of travel north of them and secure bridges and railroad tracks and things like that. He's going to assign regiments of infantry to both of these armored divisions from the 8th Infantry Division and the 79th. And both Gros and Wood are a little worried. They're like, this idea of just blasting forward without securing anything is really kind of reckless. And he's like, no, it's fine. But they are going to find that the going gets a little bit tough. But that one-day stall really infuriates Patton, but it's nothing compared to how angry he's going to be at Wood the same day. So while Gros is heading west, Wood is actually heading south. He's going to take Rennes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sorry, Mag.
Just Rennes.
And the idea is for him to go, there you go. Thank you. To basically head south and then head southwest. so that he can get that sort of lower part of the peninsula. Well, he gets to Rennes and he makes the personal decision. He sees the Germans pulling back in the east and he says, my God, what a great opportunity. So he circles the city counterclockwise, positioning himself to start heading east. And Middleton is basically jumping up and down going, no, you're going the wrong way, and basically travels out there and sees Wood, and Wood hugs him and says, we're winning the war in the wrong direction. And Middleton's like, irrelevant. You have your orders. And Middleton leaves and even sends a message to him reminding him, hey, you need to start heading southwest. Patton sees that note and thinks that Middleton's encouraging to be defensive. And so he gets mad for no reason, but Middleton fills him in on what has happened. Patton flies down to see Wood, and Wood greets him. And Wood thinks the world of Patton. He thinks he's the only real army commander who knows how to fight this war. Everybody else is coming out of the infantry. Patton's an armor guy. And he's like, man, I almost had it. And Patton said, yeah, if you had done that, I would have court-martialed your ass. Because remember, Patton is still kind of in the doghouse. He's in a little bit of trouble from slapping soldiers in Sicily and a sort of misrepresentation of himself in England when he speaks and newspapers get his name. And so he has to have the perfect campaign. He can't do anything wrong. He doesn't want Eisenhower thinking he's rebelling against him at this vital juncture. And so he says, no, we are sticking to the plan. And even though Patton probably wanted to turn east himself, he is not messing with his job. He's got his job. He's going to do it. So eventually both the 6th Armored and the 4th Armored are going to reach their ports, both a day late, both of which Patton says, God, if we hadn't had these problems, I would have captured them, without a problem. We don't really know that. That's really for speculation. Now, I mentioned, Gros being, pushing back on this idea of just racing for the ports, because what's going to happen when he gets to Brest, he will have bypassed this German infantry division we talked about, the 266, and they're going to attack his rear. So he has to basically put a screening force in front of Brest, turn his whole division around. Now, they do defeat the infantry division, but all of that fighting is giving the Germans in Brest time to build up, while he's basically got a weaker force. When Wood gets to Lorient, really, that was the real key one he wants to get to. The Germans have put together minefields and everything. And so now basically you've got 2 armor divisions laying siege to these ports, and that's kind of irrelevant. You don't need armor for this. Yeah. And so Patton is basically going to turn his back on this front, and he's going to focus on pushing east, because you've got the Germans attacking at Mortain that he's reacting to. You've got him crossing rivers at Mayenne and heading for Chartres, and now trying to encircle the Germans. This is going to take all his energy and concentration. And basically after August 8th, he's going to forget about what's going on in his Western theater. All he cares about now is getting the 6th and the 4th Armored out of there and into his drive east.
And at this point, Kevin, why is Bradley not perhaps seeing the opportunities over to the east there? I mean, we're getting into the whole unraveling the Falaise Gap, which we're not really meant to be doing today. We're meant to be talking about Brittany, but it all connects, of course. But
right,
there are people who think that. Well, I'll read a representative question we had earlier from Siggy. In hindsight, should Bradley Patton have put more resources into encirclement, the Falaise Gap operation against the German 7th, etc., than going and then gone further south and west after that? And that's the kind of representative question we're getting. Another one there: how huge was Patton's mistake to focus west instead of continuing south and southeast to encircle the German army? So people have got different interpretations, even within this sidebar, of what the right play was at this point. And, with the benefit of 80 years hindsight, was finding that perfect decision almost impossible at that time with how quickly things were changing on the battlefield?
Yeah, because I think with August, so you had all that tough fighting in June, July, and now you're breaking free, and it just seems the Germans are falling apart in front of you. They're retreating as quickly as you can, but you are very far from Berlin. And so the idea of capturing these ports there's no mention between Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower that, oh, what if the Germans blow these ports? It's if we can get in there fast enough, we got them. That is really. And then once they're invested in this, how do you pull out? And let the Germans know, well, you guys still have these. They really, I think they are just working under the assumption if they can just get there, they can take them. That's been part of the plan for a long time. They've got modern armies that need to be supplied. All of their, standard operating procedures, all their manuals are telling them this. And so I can't say like, oh, they're locked in because of their time and place, but that's what it looks like on the ground. They don't have that perspective. They can't read into the future, what's going to happen. And another thing, the American army has not done a lot of fighting at this point in the war. And, the real model is World War I, which is trench warfare, which is what the American army was fighting in July and in June and July. And they were worried about stalemate. And all of a sudden you've got this broken field in front of you. There's very few people that can say, you know what, let's just fly as fast as we can east. That goes against a lot of thinking. And so when Patton starts doing this, everybody's alarmed, the Germans and the Allies. Is he sticking his neck out? Is it going to get cut off? You're bringing supplies across a bridge in a town called Mayenne, and that's a single bridge over a river. There's incredible risk to all of this stuff. You never know what's going to pay off. So yes, it turns out the Brittany Peninsula is not the golden rainbow that the Allies thought it was, but they had no way of knowing. And everything that they had learned up to that point told them we desperately need ports in order to accomplish what we want to accomplish, which is not encircling a German army. It's breaking into Germany. That's the big picture.
And in a weird way, the two phases of the earlier Normandy campaign both were to have, though lessons were learned, they didn't really represent what was to come. The attritional phase of sitting in the bocage for the Americans and sitting in the wheat fields near Caen, that never really happened again. 11 months that followed, it was always pushing. Maybe you could argue the Hurtling got a bit kind of attritional. And then that false dawn, perhaps, of the 4th and 6th pushing down, which you've written about and you've talked about in Operation Cobra, when, frankly, there weren't many Germans ahead of them there. It was an amazing achievement by Middleton's 8th Corps, but against, frankly, not very many Germans there, which were kind of dealing over to the east with the British Bluecoat operation. But neither of those phases really predicted what was going to happen next, when the Germans by September generally start getting their act, even though they're falling back, they're getting their act together in some ways in terms of redeploying their forces. Look at Market Garden, for example. So as you say there, the experience they've gained, they've come in with very little experience in some ways, and the experience they've gained isn't really going to help them moving forward. It's about now developing a new set of tactics for the next stage of the war, I suppose.
Yeah, and I got to also add in this, Patton's not the most honest general in the U.S. Army. He'll tell Bradley he's already captured something which he hasn't, in hopes of to keep going. He does that at where is it? When he's trying to close the Fillet Pocket, and he's like, "Oh, we've already taken Argentan," and he hadn't gotten across the river. The Germans blew the bridges, and the 5th Armored Division is hammering away trying to get into the city and can't. And he's like, "Oh, I already have patrols north of the city." No, you didn't. And so it's funny. That's something I've had to deal with in my research with Patton, because in my discussions with Martin Blummenson, my old mentor, he'd say, well, this guy's, what he's saying doesn't make sense because it clashes with Patton's diary. And I'm like, not if Patton's lying to him. Yeah. And it's something that has to be considered. He would be too optimistic at times, to his own fault. Here we are looking at Saint-Malo, which goes to the 83rd Division General Macon, who is just hammering away at this. He's losing a lot of men, a lot of street fighting. And Patton's very unsympathetic towards this in a lot of ways. He's saying that, the infantry isn't fighting well enough, that we haven't trained them well enough. He's not giving any credit to the Germans, who are really, fighting almost to the last man in Saint-Malo. Do we have a picture of them together, him and Macon? I can tell you that when Patton went to visit Macon for the first, well, there's Spang. But we can talk about General Spang here. So this is Spang. He is the German 266 Infantry Division commander. He's going to get captured. The guy on our left, that's Oscar Koch, Patton's intelligence officer. You can see they're sort of in hedgerowish country there. And they've got a helmet on him because the German Luftwaffe was a bit active in this area. And he said, Patton, every question he asked him, he would salute Patton twice, and things like that. And Patton just berates him when they first meet, and just how dare you, you guys are fighting the wrong cause. And then he kind of relaxes and says, have a seat. And they do talk. And he says, why are you guys still fighting? This thing's over. And Spang says, it's, these are our orders and we will continue to do this as long as we have orders to do so. Spang complains, though, because his wristwatch and his leather coat have been stolen by members of the 6th Armored Division and the 8th Infantry. And they send officers into the groups looking for these things, and they never find them. And I've interviewed veterans who've told me exactly the name of the people that got them. I think the jacket is at a museum somewhere in Tennessee right now. That the watch was kept by the soldier that took it. So I got a lot of amusement out of that. So that gives Patton some reflection on who they're going to be fighting. He gives the guy 2 cartons of cigarettes and sends him to England. And Spang gives him some song and dance about, fighting to his last breath before he got surrounded. Basically, his command car driver just drove him right into an American unit, not realizing they'd been bypassed, and he immediately rifles at him. So Patton's going to interview a number of German generals throughout the war, but Spang was his first. So, but
just a quick question about, well, it may not be a quick question, but the shuffling of the packs that occurred in July and August, where corps leave armies and join other armies, the divisions move within corps, so that the 8th Corps that Middleton had in July, he's still got the 8th Corps, but it's different divisions with the 8th Corps, the 83rd move, the 79th move. It's kind of an alien concept for the British because we don't really do that. We might move brigades within a division occasionally, but normally that's before a campaign starts. It's while they're a train. So how significant is that? Is that these corps commanders moving forward haven't got the same team as they had earlier?
I don't really see a problem with it early on because the army is kind of green altogether.
Right.
And so you're just switching in one group. It's going to be later, really post-Battle of the Bulge, that they start swapping green divisions out for veteran divisions, both to go to the new 9th Army, the new 15th Army, and the Strategic Reserve, that you start talking about the 87th Infantry Division and the 89th, that I had to really do research. I'm like, wait, who are these guys?
Right, yeah.
And it's almost like Patton's 3rd Army, its face is entirely different going into Germany than the one that fights across France and in the Battle of the Bulge. But early on, it's not as important because, like I said, they're all kind of green divisions and they are interchangeable. It's with later battles when you've got solid veteran divisions getting swapped for green ones that it can be almost a tragic, thing. Bringing the 11th Armored Division in during the Battle of Bulge, they get smeared in their first days. They just don't know how to fight. 17th Airborne, same thing. These guys take heavy casualties learning how to fight the war against a very experienced German army.
Brilliant stuff.
Yeah, and we could also say that a lot of these guys aren't going to get experience for the whole month because they're really just outflanking Germans that aren't there and everything like that. It's the fighting in September is really going to prove it. There's my man Mort Schefflow, veteran of the 8th Infantry Division. He came on one of my tours. I think we're actually in Coutances because he got married in front of the Hotel Maison, the town hall. And if you were to go into Coutances, you can see on that building all the pot marks from artillery and airstrikes and things like that. That's one of the great things about traveling around France, is seeing the evidence of the war, even in cities and towns. So Mort started off as a BAR man. He was a replacement with the 8th Infantry during a lot of the hedgerow fighting. And he talked about the confusion of it and being feet away from Germans as they ran away from him. And then they kind of get out into the Brittany Peninsula, and he's transferred to the Scouts, and he's a second scout. So they're going out into the field at night, or even sometimes during the day, trying to like get a sense of where the Germans are and what's going on. He told a lot of great stories about meeting French civilians and getting drunk with them in the field, which he shouldn't have done. And at one point, these peasants let him into his home, and they have drinks and food. And they said, "Who's in charge here?" And one of the other soldiers says that they are. And Mort Schefflo says, No, I'm the chef, Chef Lowe," and to let the French know who's in charge. He's a corporal at this point. No, I think he's a sergeant. And he's going to lead his troops. There was at one point they come across a bunch of Belgian gates, and they find a crack in them, and they have to go single file through these Belgian gates. They're going to get all the way to Brest, and he's going to come up across this Fort Bogham, I think it's called, and there's ready-made foxholes there because it's been bombed so many times. And his lieutenant, has the men some of the men go forward, and then the word comes down, no, we got to pull these men back out of these craters that they're all in. And just then the lieutenant gets shot. The bullet goes through his bicep and then goes across his chest. And so he's out of it. And so now Mort Schefflo's in charge of the platoon, and the company commander says, "You've got to get those guys out of those foxholes." So he has to run foxhole to foxhole, telling these guys to pull back. And as he's climbing out of one, he gets shot in the back by a German sniper and breaks part of his rib cage, nicks his liver. He's going to fall down backwards into the foxhole, and all the guys are pulling back. And so he's all alone, and he can hear like gurgling from his chest as he breathes. And he realizes his heart rate's increasing, and I think he's getting a little nervous here, And then a few minutes later, a medic jumps in, and he says as he jumped in, it caused all this dirt to fall on him because it's all loose dirt, and this guy's jumping in. And he says, "I can't give you morphine. If I give you morphine, it slows your heart rate, and we can't risk that." He's really thirsty, so the medic pours water into a spoon and gives him that because, you can't have liquids if you've got an internal wound. And then around 4 p.m., some medics arrive with a leader, and they take him back behind the lines. They carry him down into a basement of a house where they've set up an aid station. And once he's on the steps like that, the blood comes out of his lung and pours and splatters on the steps. And this medic down below looks up and says, "Hey, are you spitting tobacco juice?" And Mort said, "I think the guy was just trying to cheer me up." And it actually worked. I felt better because if he's joking, then maybe my situation isn't as dire. And he has to stay in France for 7 days because anyone with a chest wound cannot fly until they've been stabilized for 7 days because of the pressure change. Because remember, these are depressurized or unpressurized cabins in C-47s. And so they give him some morphine. There is a nurse checking on him. He said, which was the best part of the trip. They flew across the channel, and he's basically going to spend the rest of the war in a British hospital, eventually transferred back to the United States. But I remember at one time he did pull up his shirt to show me his wound. It was he pulled up the back of his shirt, and it's just a pretty nasty scar. So Mort did a great deal to humanize the war for me in the campaigns. He was a great person to have on a tour. And more importantly, he later, after the tour, helped me out a D-Day faker who had been making up a bunch of stories. I can't even think of the guy's name. It makes me so angry.
The 29th guy?
The story about which one?
The 29th Division guy?
Yeah. I can't think of his name. If it comes to me, I'll say his name because I was interviewing him, the 29th guy, and Mort back to back. And I said to Mort, "Hey, your story is going to come out in WWII History Magazine later because I'm doing this guy first." And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I think that guy's a faker."
Oh, Mac.
Said, no.
Mac
Evans.
Mac Evans. Yeah. I met him.
And so I said, "Why do you think he's a faker?" He goes, "He's too young. And more importantly, he called the replacement depots Repel Deppels." And I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "We didn't call him that till 1945. So that's something I never would have known. I've always heard the term Repel Deppel. I didn't realize that there was a difference between 44 and 45. So I said, "Mort, you're wrong. I'm going to send you the article, the interview I did with him. Mort sent it back, every paragraph redline. He goes, you got this from this book, got this from this book, got this. And I was like, oh my God. So I got with Joe Balkowski, and we did the research, and we were able to prove that he was actually in a hospital in Omaha, Nebraska on June 6th. He had pneumonia on June 6, 1944. He does join the Army. He is in the Army. He gets over there in October and guards trains in Belgium. So the guy served proudly, but decided to make up this whole fake thing. And thanks to Mort Shefflow, I was able to put an end to that. So I'm sorry. I know we got off on a tangent here.
No, it's interesting because I was going to ask you about, Joe Balkowski said it, the speaking to veterans who weren't part of D-Day. So Mort there being part of the Brittany campaign, there is a feeling among those veterans that it's forgotten and that no one cares. And it's neither D-Day or Market Garden or Anzio, but the Brittany campaign, regardless of whether or not it should have been pushed at a strategic level, the guys who fought through there, as Joe talked about and John talked about, the 83rd in Saint-Malo, it was a tough campaign against some Germans in some very, very defendable positions, and needs to be discussed. And that's my point.
It's got those two elements. It does have the speed element for the first 7 days, and then it's really ground pound, trench warfare, siege warfare, and the enemy is incredibly active. And they've been given orders to hold out for the rest of the war because they're told, if you give up this port, the Allies are going to crush us. So you have to give your all in defending. And the Germans did. And these were not green troops they were going up against, or kids or old men. These were some of the cream of the German crop.
And as we said with Joe, there's nowhere to go. If you're defending Brest, it's either die or be captured, but there's nowhere to fall back to. The whole other elements of the German army falling back towards the Seine, falling back, look at the 9th and 10th S ending up in the Netherlands. But if you're in Brittany, there's nowhere to go. You might as well just keep on doing your job because, there's no hope of relief. There's no hope of anything. The Germans may get a single submarine and get 2 people out like the Japanese were doing in 44, but basically you're on your own, you're stuffed. So
and you're in a great defensive position too. You defend with concrete and all that kind of stuff, and you've got the food supplies that are prepared for this. And it actually becomes a tree. A lot of units that work on the these German defensive then get shipped east to the battles there, and they've got a bit of experience under their belt, like the 26th, the 94th divisions. They have, experienced Brittany, and now they're out fighting on the east.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. So Omar Bradley's staff sent this to Patton. Oh Lord, give me the strength to carry on another day, and may I yet succeed in getting one paper completed before it is outdated. And so that was the problem they were having at 12th Army Group headquarters, is Patton was moving so fast through Brittany and then east that all their operational reports and situational reports were becoming obsolete as they tried to make future plans because the tanks are just rolling free.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was a fun sort of a tribute to that. And that's actually in Patton's photo album. So if he's got that there, it meant a lot to him that he kept that.
And it's a good time to ask you a question from Scott Grimwood. That speed with which certain elements are moving, would Patton lose understanding sometimes of where his units were, believing his units had taken objectives when they had not? You mentioned how he would sometimes lie a little bit, but was he always in total knowledge of where his units are?
Yes, he certainly was. I'm trying to think to give you examples. So he took one of his, I think it was the 6th Cavalry Group, because he didn't trust his radio and communications. So he took a cavalry group and had them in jeeps racing out to division and regimental headquarters and corps headquarters, bring him information back as fast as they could. He called it his household cavalry after the British household cavalry that defended the Queen. And it proved to be a very effective tool. He's going to use it throughout the war. And, if he didn't have the control that he did, he wouldn't have been able to make the maneuvers that he makes during World War II. But he's also he leaves room for chaos, I guess. And a good example of this, one of his commanders of the 12th Corps, Cook, becomes very sick. and they have to replace him. They replace him with Mantonetti. And when Mantonetti comes in, he looks at the map and sees how spread out 4th Armored is. And he goes, oh my God, this is a mess. We've got to stop and consolidate. And, P. Wood with 4th Armored is like, no, we don't. We got the Germans on the run. They don't know how confused we are. We just need to just keep pressing. And so, obviously Patton didn't have a problem with that either. He'd been doing this much longer than Eddie. And so he gave his commanders a lot of leeway, and kind of went away from the playbook that they were teaching at Fort Leavenworth, like, hey, what works, works. And so it was very unconventional, but it worked. And Patton, very much in command of the doing, but then he would just try to project too much. He would do that to the guys beneath him and above him. Hey, we need to take this objective yesterday, like almost incomprehensible objectives. Sometimes they met him, sometimes they didn't, but he knew he was asking for the impossible. So, they needed to work with the possible. So he would sort of lie to the guys above him. Hey, I've already taken these towns. This thing's going to fall in like 10 minutes. And then he would lie to the guys below him saying, hey, I just talked to Eisenhower. We need this tomorrow. He does a bit of that during the Battle of the Bulge with the drive to Bastogne, and it's incredibly unreasonable, but that's the personality you get with Patton.
Brilliant.
Oh, what we're looking at here is Patton Day. I think this is August 25th. The U.S. Army designates this Patton Day. And I think this really tells you where Patton's mind and body are, because he's crossing the Seine River, basically on the way to Paris. So he's really got his back to the Brittany Peninsula. And you can see the cameras are filming him and everything. They let a press contingent and follow him around for the day. And so he visits all of his corps commanders in the East, and makes a big play of it. So you can tell that Brittany is just not a concern of his. I think it's August 8th when we talked about with Brest and Lorient being encircled. That's the last day Patton spends in Brittany that month. He's going to go back one more time on August 30th. But from August 8th to August 30th, all his attention is on the East. So I think that gives a good play of where Patton's mind is.
And to be honest, when you look at that map you showed, it does kind of make sense. Yeah, for all the use of the ports that ended up not being used, the Germans and the heart of the Third Reich are right on that map, not left. And so going east does kind of seem logical. If you're a 4-year-old boy or girl playing toy soldiers on the floor, you're going to want to put your toy soldiers east because that's where the enemy are.
And just to add to that, Paul, in Sicily, when Patton drives north to Palermo, he sends forces both west and east. Now, obviously, east is Messina, but he sends his provisional corps west. That's where the 82nd Airborne goes to clear out the island. It's like we've got these units so that the battlefield is too big for them. Let's clear, let's destroy the enemy wherever he lays.
Yeah. So,
that is part of it. Now, the army, his corps are becoming so distant that Patton has to get in a little Storch aircraft or an L-3 Grasshopper to fly around to keep an eye on all of his troops. Patton is actually a certified pilot. He flew a couple of planes in England before the invasion. But here he's flown around and, at one point he flies over enemy lines accidentally and they have to find, they zoom down on some trucks and they see the swastikas on the hoods of the vehicles. And so they fly back up, they find a train track and follow the train track back to American lines. But this is Patton being in touch with all of his troops the best way he can find. And that's, this aircraft for a lot of different visits to the front. A lot of times also he would drive to the front, to the Corps and Division headquarters and then fly back or drive back sort of under a blanket because he always wanted his troops to see him moving forward, never back. He didn't want to put the idea of retreat at all in their minds. I thought that was a very important psychological factor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the last photo is this one.
There we go. So this is his last visit to Saint-Malo. Now, the first visit when Macon sees him and he hasn't captured it, Macon's really worried and he thinks Patton's going to fire him. And Patton rolls up and sees the worried look on his face and basically puts his arm around him and says, you're doing a great job. And that just greatly relieves Macon. He like, okay, I still got this. So Patton visits him on August 30th. And at this point, he basically, the Saint-Malo is going to crumble the next day. So they've really gotten into the city and everything. Mission accomplished, at least at this port. Now like we said, it's you've been to Saint-Malo, Saint-Malo, how do you say it again?
Malo, yeah.
Yep. And it's just not a huge port city. It's very low to the ground and everything like that. Very ancient city. And I wouldn't even know if it qualifies as a city. It's more of a town. But at least they can say they've gotten one of these ports, chalk one up for the Third Army, because then right after this, all the troops in Brittany are going to be transferred to the Ninth Army under Simpson. And that's no longer going to be Patton's kind of thorn in his side, or his stagnant front, as I like to refer to it. So there you go.
And thank you for that. Just to kind of, wrap things up, but it could be a 10-minute conversation. With retrospect, that August campaign, we had the decision at the last minute kind of to go to Paris. That Bradley just said it's just a place on the map. Then there you have the encirclement at Falaise that wasn't really predicted. Following Cobra, the Lutich that had followed Cobra that then the Allies react to. How would you rate, perhaps out of a score of 10, Patton's management of August, for example? It was a high point, I suppose, wasn't it? What would you give it out of 10?
Oh, I'd give it a 10 out of 10. I believe that his race across France was the command. I think it's more significant than the Battle of the Bulge, because it just changes the face of the U.S. Army of the battle in Europe. Remember, they're talking stalemate, and you blink your eye and he's basically liberated almost all of northern France, and I shouldn't say the Allies have, but it changes the rhythm of the war. The Battle of the Bulge, which is really, a lot of people call that his climactic point. He's fighting in one direction. He turns 2/3 of his army north. One of the corps is really static, so he really only moves one corps north. But the fighting is basically the same on the drive to Bastogne that it was in the Sarre campaign just before it. This tough grind, the Germans fighting smartly in retreat, whereas this just changes everything. When they would interview soldiers before this breakout, the soldiers were calculating how many more days or weeks they had to live. By the time you get to the end of August, they're talking about being in Berlin and celebrating. Just the mental attitude of everybody has just a 180, that they're all now, we want to get rid of the Germans, we want to kill the Germans, we're going to get rid of them and we're going to win, whereas before it's like, geez, I hope I live till tomorrow. That psychological change, I think, is more significant in the campaign of Europe than the Battle of the Bulge.
Okay, thank you. My final question, and I'm going to paraphrase what Bruce Day said, is Patton and logistics, because the people who don't like Patton say that he doesn't understand logistics. He pushes ahead without understanding the fuel, the ammunition, things like that, and that perhaps someone like Montgomery or Bradley understands that train behind better. But against that, you have the fact that it's the railways that Patton pushes for and all that. So how is it a bit of the wrong label to put on Patton, that he doesn't understand logistics?
Yeah, I would say so, because remember, again, experienced guy from North Africa and Sicily. And logistics aren't really a problem for him there, because his armies aren't moving that fast. And when they are, it's not over that far of a distance where that's a problem. They adopt mules in Sicily. And then when you get to Europe, again, totally different atmosphere of him racing forward. And I think it catches everybody off guard, the speed in which he moves. And they're so used to this incremental advancement that that's how they do logistics, that all of a sudden Patton's turned, no, he can't go that fast. He doesn't understand logistics. Where his attitude is, if I move that fast, you guys are going to have to adopt. You're going to have to, adapt to it. Yeah. And, when he's racing through Brittany, they've got airplanes flying, dropping supplies by parachute. That had never really been done before. They are adapting to his needs. And if he has any lacking during that Bolt breakout, he's all about logistics all through September, October, November, preparing to break into Metz. he just is incremental on his maps, keeping track of how much gallons of gasoline each tank is going to need, things like that. And he was like that going into Sicily. You know, he was issuing orders to telling guys like, deflate all your trucks tires to half because of the soft soil coming ashore and everything like that. And then you inflate them once you get on board. And this is stuff he paid attention to. So I think that was sort of Eisenhower's needly. He had to plug something on George he could hold him to. And he was like, oh, you're not good at logistics, you know, and it really is not true. In fact, you know, when you get to the Battle of the Bulge and the Rhine, you know, Patton has been stocking up bridging equipment and fuel, you know, for his breakout to the Rhine. All he has to do is turn his army north because he's got all the supplies close enough that they can, you know, make that maneuver. And by the time they get to the Rhine River, they got so many bridges, you know, waiting to be built behind the lines. So I think that is an unfair label to put on Patton. I think he changed the war in August of 1944 and expected everybody to catch up. And eventually they do. But you know, there was decisions above him that changed the direction of that the fuel and supplies, you know, not him.
Yeah.
And a huge factor in this are airborne campaigns. I don't want to lay, you know, like, well, Martin Garden never should have happened. But remember, they're trying to use airborne operations throughout August, and you know, and they're just not needed. But just planning them grounds those planes, so they're not bringing in fuel. They're preparing for these airborne operations. So when you're looking, I think there was at least 3 that they planned before Market Garden. Every time one of those got revved up, Patton was losing that air supply that he relied so heavily on. So no, I disagree with the idea of Patton being poor with logistics. He did his best with the tools he had.
Brilliant stuff. Well, we will end things there, Kevin. We will invite you back later on to talk about something else because you're always good value. And this, of all the various Patton shows you've done, because you know, for those who haven't read your books, you're not you don't. It's not just a complete celebration of Patton all the way through. You knock him when he deserves it. You know, there are huge moments in his career where you call him out for things he did wrong. But this is a period where the Patton way is working, I guess, is what we'd call it, wasn't it?
Yeah. This is Patton's month. August 1944 is completely Patton's month.
Yeah. Well, we'll bring you back to talk about something more negative later on. So, folks, I've got my 2 copies there, Volume 1 and Volume 2. The links in the description below. We're back in an hour's time with Jean-Loup from France to talk about the archaeological work he does in Provence and that area around there, kind of following Operation Dragoon, which is kind of our next subject later on. Click like and subscribe, buy my guests' books, but I will see you all in about 55 minutes' time. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Boom.